So before I begin, just to answer a little bit about why should any of us care about doing something called the Amherst College Press, here's one paragraph of a recent essay written by Joanna Drucker. Some of you may know her. She's at UCLA and a wonderful scholar of the alphabet itself. She's a person who writes and thinks a lot about scholarly communication. And here's a little bit of her recent essay about digital humanities in the Los Angeles Review of Books. So she takes as read the idea that there is a crisis in scholarly communication. And here's what she said. Why should this crisis matter to a non-academic? Because academe provides a gold standard of scholarship. Because its ideas filter down, sometimes through unsuspecting channels, and stimulate thought in virtually every field of human endeavor. Because the fate of the humanities is being influenced by a campaign of misinformation, numbers of students enrolled in humanities courses are actually up, for instance, not down. Because, here's a warning, the hyped myths about digital publishing are far from reality. Because much of the knowledge currently being produced is at risk of being locked in silos and kept behind firewalls. Because large publicly supported projects, for example, the Digital Public Library of America, need to succeed to keep intellectual life and public discourse vital. To make sure humanities scholarship thrives, it is crucial that we cut through the pixel dust-induced illusion to the practical realities of what digital technology has to offer to scholarship. Thus, Joanna Drucker. Pretty good set of reasons, I think, why a place like Amherst College should be invested in a project like a scholarly press. So, with that, let me do a little bit of introduction. And the introduction of me is shaped around the fact that as I've gone around introducing myself as the new director of the Amherst College Press, I have found that the one reputation we've gained for ourselves, thanks to Bryn, is that we are the anti-book press. That we want to end books, okay? So first thing that I want to say is, growing up in the middle of Michigan, when I went to elementary school, this was my introduction to the wonderful world of scholarly publishing, right? My Weekly Reader. Came every week. It was the greatest day of the week when I got the new edition of My Weekly Reader. And some of you who are nodding like this will remember that about 2 or 3 times a year, in the back of My Weekly Reader, there would be an order form for books, right? And then on that magical day, after you had brought in your order form with your money in an envelope from your parents, about 3 weeks later, a box would land on Mrs. Stedman's desk. And she would call forward Gary Beckstrand, who would get his 2 books, and then she would call Jody Vandenberg, who would get her book, and Aaron Jack, who would get her book, and at the very end, she would call me forward and hand me the box. Because in the box were the 7 books or the 10 books that my parents, thank you parents, had ordered for me. And they were such classics as Encyclopedia Brown and Catcher with a Glass Arm and The Mouse and the Motorcycle and Stuart Little. I lived in that period of American literature that flourished with the rodent on vehicles theme. And Touchdown for Tommy and Emil and the Detectives and all of this, okay? I grew up in book culture. I am a card-carrying member of book culture. There's my card from the Boston Athenaeum. It's in my wallet, okay? And the only club I belong to is a club of people who love books called the Club of Odd Volumes. Really, there is such a place. So I am a fully fledged, paid-up dues member of book culture. And I'm here to tell you that the Amherst College Press is going to create books, okay? We are. Just not first, just not first. All right, so that's me. Let's talk a little bit about the crisis in scholarly publishing. Maybe the best way to describe the crisis is to start with an archetype. And for the archetype, let's use the best known, most respected, most highly prestigious of all university presses. We all know which one it is, and it's the one that is the gold standard that Johanna Drucker mentioned. It's the one that if you publish there, you get tenure, right? We all know it as Sirius University Press. And we all know that it is Sirius University Press because it has a very serious colophon. That is the colophon. Now, what does Sirius University Press do? The first thing it does is that it acquires work. It has a staff of people known as acquisitions editors who are subject matter experts in their field. They are scholars in their own right. They have chosen a different career, but that does not mean they are not very well informed about their fields, and they go to the conferences and they mix it up among their colleagues and they identify who has the best new idea that we want to bring to fruition in Sirius University Press, okay? So we begin with a group of people, could be 6, could be 10, could be a dozen, highly trained people with budgets to go travel and meet the scholars who are generating new ideas. And once we've found them, we want to evaluate their work. We do that by means of our in-house acquisitions editors, but also through proposal readers, through peer reviewers, that basic fundamental building block of all evaluating scholarly merit. We send it out for peer review. And finally, at the high end of our process at Sirius University Press, we will have an editorial board. And the job of the editorial board is not to read every manuscript, it's to review the whole process by which a title came into our shop. So we'll review the proposal, the peer reviews, what the reviews said, how the author responded, and what the final typescript is. And the acquisition editor will actually write a report to the editorial board about what this book is and why we should publish it. Then we're going to edit or refine this work. We have another department at Sirius University Press called Manuscript Editorial. And their job is gently to disabuse scholars in the academy of the notion that their prose is perfect at the creation. We may have fact checkers, we may have site checkers, we may have indexers who provide that index at the back of the book. We may need to manage the permissions of the stuff that's quoted or the images that are used in the book. And we'll finally have to have a contract with that author that determines our legal relationship with them, okay? Then we're going to have to design the book, both in type and the book itself. And we're going to have to somehow integrate any figures that go together with the text. We're going to have to lay out the endnotes at the end. We're going to have to make all of this a visual artifact. And when that's done, we'll produce it. We have to have relationships with printers. If it's a highly sort of difficult graphic work, if it has a lot of figures in it, if it has a lot of color in it, the chances are pretty high that Sirius University Press will have a vendor relationship with a press in China, where that work can be done for lower cost. We also, though, have to have this talent. We have to know that publishing Professor Serrett's next work on the death penalty in America will probably result in sales of close to 50,000 books. All right. Whereas publishing Bryn Geffert's next book on the history of Professor Serrett will probably publish 500 books. We have to get that right. That's a talent. That's a talent that Sirius University Press has long ago figured out. When this is done, we're going to have to promote the work. We'll advocate for the author. We'll engage with the field. Those acquisitions editors are part of this effort. We're going to get the work reviewed because that's how scholarship sort of proved its mettle in the world of scholars, right? But then we have to distribute it. We have to store it, ship it, and market it. Why does Sirius University Press, with all of its reputation, spend money publishing a catalog? Librarians, you get catalogs, right? I've seen them in your offices. What do you do with them? Out they go, right? Sirius University Press publishes catalogs for other authors, not for librarians. It's a way of telling authors, see who's on our team, right? And then we come to this. Sirius University Press sells its book. It sells the books to people like us, and it sells the book to libraries. So end users buy the book. Here's the end user in the bookstore, and this is actually, I found this here in the library. This is a book plate from a book somewhere up on the second floor where I live. to show that somebody gave money to Amherst College Library to buy the book, which happens to be about the development of the middle class in England of the 19th century. Okay? So libraries and readers buy the books, and when Professor Serrett's book on the death penalty in America is turned into a movie, Sirius University Press will have secondary rights to sell. In order for that to happen, and we'll probably cut in the author a little bit on those additional rights. So there are secondary rights in this picture, not just movies, but reprints or collecting a chapter in an edited volume, or so derivative work. By the way, this part of the cycle is the revenue generating part of the cycle, right? The revenue quadrant that makes this whole picture turn around again. So here is the picture of the world for Sirius University Press. What is happening to that world? This is happening to that world. It's all being turned upside down. Why? Well, for a few reasons. Let's take an example of a specific press that I won't name, but I had a meeting with just last week. This is a press that receives about 1,200 submissions a year. That means in the mail comes an envelope with a monograph, a manuscript. Dear Sirius University Press, I have written the following stellar work and I wish you would publish it. Okay? 1,200 of those come in over the transom every year. They publish 130 books. How many of the 130 books resulted from the submissions that came in the mail? I hear 10, 25, roughly, in the case of this press. Okay? The others came from active engagement by the acquisitions editors. They were specifically solicited. They were not the result of submissions. Okay? So that's the beginning of the picture that's beginning to change for university presses. It's getting harder and harder as a mere submitter to get considered by a well-established, highly prestigious press. Here's the other thing that's changing. In 2003, 32% of the revenue from this press was realized from sales to places just like this, libraries. Last year, it was 16%. If your business model has a third of its revenue coming from one source, and that source gets cut in half, your business model has got to change. And by the way, that number of 16% is declining even farther. It's just on a downward trend. Why is that happening? Because acquisition budgets are dropping. So library sales are declining as a function of reductions in acquisition budgets. Okay? What about the people like us who go to bookstores? Well, the average book price in 2003 across all scholarly publishers, $63.88. What do you suppose it was last year? It was $87.68. So sales to people like us are declining as a function of rising price. So there's two sources of pressure on this picture for Sirius University Press. Or, here's the data. This is from a Baker & Taylor, which is a book seller, but also provides a service to libraries of just providing just huge numbers of titles. You can just read this from the bottom up. Here's that average price in 2003, and there it is last year. But take a look at this number too. This is the total number of titles being published. And see how it takes a drop like in here, and then it rises again, and it hasn't yet gotten back to the highest number. That number is likely to start contracting again because universities are closing presses. I'll say a little bit more about why that's happening later, but the general picture here is one of contraction. So to come back to this slide, how is this specific press solving the problem of that decline in revenue from traditional sources, libraries and individual sellers? Anybody guess? I'll tell you what the director of this press told me. They're working with literary agents. They're working with representatives of authors whom they know will sell. So his words, our answer is we're moving to the retail end. And that's a solution. I mean, they will solve the problem and cover the 32 full-time people who work at the press now. But if you're that first-time author, it's going to get harder and harder for you to get the attention of this. So that is the picture right now for Sirius University Press. And this is the picture for academic publishing generally. This is, I've just described, I hope, why we call this a crisis. There's a non-sustainable picture in this picture. When I study this, I wind up asking three questions. And we're in an academic environment. What we do with problems is that we start teasing them apart by asking questions. Here are the questions that I've been asking. The first is, think for a minute about all of those Sirius University presses, right? Here are the two oldest ones. By the way, can anybody tell me, what was the first U.S. academic press? What is the oldest one currently in existence? Anybody know? It's the Johns Hopkins University Press, okay? And the second oldest one is Chicago. And then Stanford. And then Princeton. And then Yale, and only then Harvard. And more recently, MIT. But what do you notice about all of these institutions? R1s, right? They're all giant research universities. So far in the world of academic publishing, the major players are basically the outlets of large Research One universities. And now we're in this crisis. So I have this question. How might a liberal arts institution offer a different voice in the field of scholarship? It might be the case that, what we say about places like Amherst is we do excellent teaching. Now, I know I've come into a place where we're having a conversation about what might it mean for us to be a research college, to begin breaking down that dichotomy between the research university and the teaching college. What would it be to be a research college? But I also wonder if what you're doing is producing scholarship in the form of publishing, what if your focus as a teaching institution would be the creation of teachable scholarship? What would that look like? How would it be different from this universe? So that's the first question. Here's the second question. For a long time, the gold standard of scholarly publishing would have been the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? And I should have brought my tote bag downstairs from my office with me, but I had, the reason I had the images of the books from the Scholastic, my weekly reader, is because I still have the books. That's to give me bona fides among my librarian colleagues. But yeah, I still kept the books. And I also brought with me, a volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica that my first grade teacher mother bought from the door-to-door salesman so that her young son would have an opportunity. It was a great pitch, right? But the Encyclopedia Britannica had scholars and acquisitions editors and a team of door-to-door salespeople. It was a huge operation, and we all know what happened to the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? Did you come to the library to use the Encyclopedia Britannica? No. What do you use? What? You do? No. You use Encarta. Right? Don't you use Encarta? We all know that Encarta was what took over the Encyclopedia Britannica because it was digital. And digital is the way of the future. What is this Wikipedia you're speaking of? Okay, right. Wikipedia. You don't use Encarta. In fact, Encarta died in 2009. But that's an interesting thing. Because the Encyclopedia, the Britannica, by the way, still exists, just so you know. It's a firm. All of those scholarly presses that we talked about earlier, Harvard, Yale, Chicago, Oxford, Cambridge, they're firms, okay? They're hierarchically organized institutions that support the function of centralized decision-making to produce a product called scholarly books. Encarta was a firm, just like Britannica. It just was a firm that did a different product. But Wikipedia is not a firm. Wikipedia is a commons. And here I'm drawing on an idea from Yochai Benkler's book, The Wealth of Networks, where he talks about commons-based peer production as an alternative mode of producing ideas, and specifically ideas in the scholarly realm, okay? So my question is, what would happen if we made the production of scholarly work less like a firm and more like a commons? If it engaged the participation of more people in the supporting institution of the press. If you visit most scholarly presses today, they live in offices that are physically separate from the universities themselves. They have almost no engagement with the community of scholars that bears the name of the university on the spine. What if we did something different? What if we were less like a firm and more like the commons that Wikipedia represents? It's a question. Here's my third question. Remember this little problem, which is becoming a vicious cycle. There's declining revenue for purchasing books, which leads to a reduction in the number of publishers and in the number of titles, which leads to pressure on the publishers themselves to more carefully select authors who will sell work, which leads to shrinking opportunities for young scholars to communicate, and it just keeps going around and around and around. Why? Ultimately because it's all driven by the market, right? So my third question is, what would happen if we delinked the creation and communication of scholarly ideas from the market? What if we just started by saying, we're out of the market? We don't want to be in the market. We're not going to generate our revenue from the market. We know this is not cost-free, but we're not going to link ourselves to the way the market works in order to make our judgments about the creation and communication of ideas. So, I have questions about what if we did publishing from the perspective of a liberal arts college? What if we did it more like a commons and less like a firm? And what if we just got out of the market and did it in a different way? And those are the questions that lead to this. Isn't that like a sun rising? You want to see that again? This is like, yeah? Good. That's our answer. Here's how we're going to be different. We're going to get out of the market. We're going to be an open access press. So we give up the first of those streams of revenue. We give up the sales part, right? Then we're going to be a Creative Commons press. The work is going to be licensed for reuse. We're going to give up most of, not all of, that secondary source of revenue. We're going to be a digital-first press with an option to print. Like I said, I'm a fully paid-up member of Book Culture, so we're going to create books, but not first. First, we'll make digital artifacts. We're going to do it from a liberal arts perspective. And all of this means we're going to have to create the revenue to make this whole thing work in the middle. So I'll say a little bit more about what that means. So let's redo what we did for Sirius University Press in our own frame. Because we're going to have to do the same. We're still going to have to acquire work. We're not going to really have acquisitions editors with large budgets to go traveling to scholarly conferences. I know, believe me. So we're going to have to think more like a commons. We're going to need people on the faculty here at Amherst who are the folks who go to scholarly conferences to be talent scouts for the press, to hear great ideas that are sort of rising in their fields and come to us to say, you really should talk to this person. Or we're going to have to pay careful attention to the folks who come through to use our special collections in the library here, or who come to give lectures in the college, and ask ourselves, would this fit in our publishing program? We're going to have to think differently about how we acquire the work, because we don't have a paid staff of people to do this. We've got to solve this more like a commons than a firm. And in some way, we can acquire work by leveraging the reputation of a place called Amherst College. Everybody I talk to when I introduce myself as the director of something called the Amherst College Press, they all say, oh, well, you're going to publish stuff on literature, right? Okay, well, that's a signal to me about what we're known for. We should make some use of that. We're still going to have to evaluate work. We still need proposal readers. We still need peer reviewers. We still need an editorial board. All of that doesn't go away. In order to get our bona fides as a place doing scholarship of merit, we have to show that we've done the same standard routine that any other press does. But then it gets a little different. We're going to edit and review the work as well, but we're going to need both editors and technologists. When we first sit down with an author, we're going to need to have both an editor and a person who's going to build this digital artifact to understand how complex is this, what the author wants to do. So from a very early point in our engagement with authors, we're going to have to understand the digital profile of what they're doing, as well as sort of the subject matter profile. We still have to do all the rest of this. We have to check the facts, we have to check the sites, we may need to provide an index if it's a printed artifact. We still have a contract, even though it's a Creative Commons operation, it's a contract that stipulates a Creative Commons license. And then our design process looks very different. We'll need a research computing function in order to build the pieces of this digital artifact and make sure it works together. We're going to need technologists who will do that and who will integrate the text and the various kinds of media that go into the work. When we produce it, we're going to be producing stuff that isn't, at least in the first instance, printed artifact. It'll be a web page. It'll be downloadable media. And we're going to have to test this before we release it to people who depend on it for scholarship. We're going to have to make sure it doesn't break before we set it out into the world. We do this just like any other press. We will have to be the best advocate our authors have ever had, especially because we're new at this. So developing our reputation depends in part on being their best friend when they have entrusted their work to us. We'll have to engage with the field in the same way and make sure the work gets reviewed in the same way. We'll have a new problem, though, that serious university press does not have. How does a university press solve the problem of preserving its work? It sells the book to the library. And it says, you deal with it from here on out, right? It's the library's problem to figure out where is the book, who has the book at the moment, where did the book last go? All of that stuff the press does not have to worry about. We will. We'll have to worry about how is it kept in a repository? How is it preserved? How can it be found? So we already are part of a shared repository called LOCKSS. Lots of copies keep stuff safe is what that stands for. We're going to have to make sure all of our work goes there as well as into our own digital repository. And we'll also probably want to have relationships with what are known as closed repositories, stuff where your digital stuff goes to be kept under lock and key and not accessed by anybody unless an earthquake swallows up Amherst College and we suddenly disappear and access to our work is still needed. Problems that a traditional press has never really had to solve. Finally, we've got a different distribution problem to solve. We don't sell stuff, we post stuff. So we have to make it discoverable. We have to make sure people can find it. We might want to create an RSS feed, a really simple syndication feed, so that people can just quickly follow us and know when new stuff comes out of the press, rather than having catalogs that we print and send out. So our picture looks very different. Remember what used to be here? This was the revenue quadrant. The green stuff, there's no green here. Where's the green? Well, we'll have to do this in a somewhat different way. And here's, and I know I say this with the dean of the college in the room, but let me begin with a little quote. This is a quote from the fellow who founded Johns Hopkins University. He said that one of the most noble missions of any university is both to create and communicate its knowledge to the world outside the lecture hall. What I think that means is, core to the mission of a place called Amherst College is the creation and communication of ideas. It's something fundamental to who we are and what we do. Because that is our mission, we get certain social privileges. One of them is exemption from taxation. And one of them is the fact that when people give us gifts, those gifts are charitable gifts. They're given special treatment in terms of the tax code. So if central to our mission is the communication of ideas, and because of that mission we get special treatment, I make the argument that we have a responsibility arising from our privileges to give back in the form of transmitting these ideas. We're going to have to fund this operation out of central revenue. That's what I'm saying, not out of sales in the market. If we're committed to this idea of open access, then we've got to pay for it. It doesn't happen for free. We've got to do it in the middle. So remember how we had that book plate that said this? Which meant that the family of John Petropoulos, who I don't know, did anybody know John? Yes? Okay, all right. The family of, people raised their hands, the family of John Petropoulos gave money so that I could pull that book off the shelf and say, John must have been a great guy, because somebody gave money that the library could buy this book. But what if instead we had a book plate that looked like this? Development and production of this work was made possible by the generosity of the family of John Petropoulos. What if we used the money to make the book instead of to buy the book? That's a centrally funded model. That's using the resources of the institution to create and communicate knowledge. That's the model that we have here. So the green arrow is in the middle. It's not on the outside. So our process looks a little different from the process of the traditional university press. We have some big choices to make. So here I'm going to shift into talking about 3 different areas that I think we've already identified that we have some basic decisions that we need to make. You may think of others, but these are the 3 that keep me up at night. The first is subject matter. We say of ourselves that we are an open access press with a focus on the liberal arts. A most vividly vague statement. So what does that mean? What will we do? And how, most importantly, for us right now, how will we choose what to do? What are we going to? What's our process for choosing it? What are we going to focus on? How are we going to make that choice? We might start here. Because we're going to issue works that are digital first, we want to find and support authors who approach their projects as digital first. I've just met Miriam Kolar. Hi, Miriam. Miriam's the postdoctoral fellow in the digital humanities in the 5 colleges. Miriam does incredibly awesome stuff, and she does it in digital ways. She thinks of her research digitally. That might be the sort of author that, because we're doing digital first work, that we start working with, okay? But there are no clear standards for assessing the scholarly merit of digital work. Those of you who are in these fields know that better than I do. So at least we need to be part of the broader conversation about creating the standards by which this work will be evaluated. Here's a quick little first page of a review article of a couple of books that have been written about how do we evaluate digital scholarship. This is a churning conversation right now. There are no clear guidelines. So how we choose our subject matter has got to have something to do with how we evaluate the work that will come in to us as a possible publication. Here's another way of thinking of the same problem. We want to create work at the cutting edge of digital scholarship. It's going to be complex, it's going to have text and data sets and a variety of file formats. It'll be really interesting, it'll be multimodal. Here's a couple of examples. Some of you may know this book, Debates in the Digital Humanities by Gold, Matthew Gold. Really interesting book. This is a book on the web. It's also a book published by the University of Minnesota Press. Here's their colophon right there. The book exists in the Amherst College Library. I was going to have it with me, except it's been checked out. But the book is a static artifact. The web page is a dynamic artifact. This is still changing. Or you may know this, Learning from YouTube. This is a book that appears in the catalog of the MIT Press. But you can't buy it. It's not a book. It's just this web presence. This is the book. That's all there is to the book. So one way to approach the how do we publish, how do we choose what we publish problem could be we want to do stuff that's cutting edge, complex, interesting, multimodal. But we also are committed to the idea that everyone anywhere with an internet connection should be able to have access to our work. This is a question that came up in a meeting we just had, and Miriam asked it. What about in a place where we don't have great bandwidth? What about in the developing world? What about scholars in Latin America or in Africa? I do some work in Tanzania, and I think all the time about a visit I made to the library of the University of Dar es Salaam. And it was like walking back 15 years in time as far as the technology. So if we build all that really cool, complex stuff, it may not be accessible against that standard that we've sort of held ourselves up to. Here's a first page of a study in the Journal of Electronic Publishing that gives some scientific background to the idea that when you publish open access work, scholars in the developing world use it. They find it and they use it. They have access to it. So when we think about, downloading a Kindle book for, what, $5? It's like, it's pocket change, right? And even that is an impossibly high barrier to somebody in, say, Peru or in Tanzania. So we want to make our work accessible, and at the same time we want to make it complex. That's a trade-off. That's a trade-off. Second problem, how are we going to choose the platform? Once we get this work, we've got to build it. We're an open access press. You would think that by ethos, we should use open source tools like Pressbooks. But if we really want to create cool stuff, we got to use platforms that people have already built that does really cool stuff. We just heard from one such place this afternoon, Creativist. We're also going to talk to Highwire Press, which is a function of Stanford, but trust me, it's a proprietary solution. And we're going to talk to some people at O'Reilly Communications, building a thing called Atlas. There are people out there who do this already. They do it really, really well, better than anything that's out there in the open source world. But it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. Third problem, once we've created the work, once we've figured out our platform and we've built the work, how do we make sure it's found? And how do we make sure it's preserved? Well, we can use ACDC, our own institutional digital repository, and we can use shared repositories like I mentioned LOCKSS. There's also Portico and Clocks that are out there. But absolutely nobody can tell you how much that's going to cost. Right now, we kind of think we know, but we have no idea. 20 years from now, it may go up, it may go down. We just don't know what we're committing ourselves to. But we are committing to the idea that we're in this for the long haul. If an author entrusts her work to us, we at least have to be able to say back to her, 25, 30 years from now, to the end of your career and beyond, that work will be available through the Amherst College Press. So I've charted out 3 different sort of questions that we're facing. Not just what, but how are we going to choose what we publish, what's the platform we're going to use, and what are the long-term issues we have about discovery and repository. This whole thing is like a giant balance. Finding the right path through these trade-offs, at least for me right now, is like creating this balance in all of this. So here's the point at which I'm actually going to hand some of this work to you. I am creating a commons, right? So join my commons. I need input. Here are 4 questions I'd like to pose. The first one is, how do we choose, right? How do we choose the subject fields we want to focus on? We have a whole universe to choose from. We're a liberal arts college. We cannot do everything. We have to do a few things well. That's how we will leverage our reputation in a way that's meaningful and coherent to scholars outside of Amherst. So, do we focus on subject areas? Oh, Amherst, literature. Do we focus on technological profile? We're looking for digital scholars who think digitally about digital work. And ultimately, that thing I asked at the beginning, if we're coming at this from a liberal arts perspective, not from a Research One perspective like every other press, what makes for teachable research? Is that something we should care about? So my first question for you to think about is, how do we choose? Second, how do we build? Once we've chosen it, how do we build it? It's this question about open source versus proprietary platforms. But also, we're going to have to create within the community of the college some really strong technological bones to build this on. My phrase for that is research computing support. We're going to need really skilled technologists and coders to help us build this stuff and to keep it working. And that is a research computing problem. We're bringing, I think, to Amherst a new generation of scholars who think of computing as a research tool, not just to make my printer work and make my email work, but How do I create and maintain large data sets? How do I do mapping through data? How do I do data mining? Those are all research computing questions. We're going to have to, within the press, be a part of building that capacity here. Third question, how do we convene this commons that I'm talking about? How do we create stakeholders in what is less like a firm and more like a commons when we speak of this thing called the Amherst College Press? And at least it's going to have to involve faculty, of course, but the authors that we're engaging as well, and just maybe students to whom we're providing an experiential education pathway and scholarly ideas and communication, and maybe donors, and maybe alumni. We have alumni who are involved in the publishing world, who have something to offer back to us thinking through these questions. How do we create that commons? How do we engage this thing horizontally and not as a hierarchically organized, centralized decision-making firm? And last, how do we attract the authors that we want to produce, whose ideas we want to communicate to a broader world? How do we get them to sign on with a new press? What assurances do we need to provide? I already said one, we will promise that this work will be sustained. That's a big promise. Oxford University Press does not have to make that promise. Stuff goes out of print every day. We do have to make that promise. How do we give that assurance? When I have lunches with young scholars, as I did recently with Miriam, I feel like this man. Anybody know who that is? The music man, right? That's what I feel like. I feel like the guy who's getting everybody to buy their instrument, and I don't know anything about music, right? But I feel like that. I feel like I'm trying to get this orchestra going. How do we solve that problem? How do we get young scholars and established scholars, even better, to say, yes, I want to work with you? So those are the questions I have for you to consider. And that's my pitch. This is our poster.